I moved to this quiet little town to get away from the noise and chaos of city life. It was a picturesque place with rolling hills, quiet streets, and neighbors who kept to themselves. The house I bought was old, maybe 100 years, creaky wooden floors and ivy creeping up the sides of the walls. It was the kind of place that oozed character and history, but it was also eerily quiet. Too quiet at times. I lived alone, or at least I used to before I got Baxter, my German Shepherd. He was a rescue dog, a bit skittish at first, but warmed up to me quickly. For the first few months, everything was normal. Baxter would follow me around the house, curl up beside me at night, and bark occasionally at passing cars or squirrels. He was my companion, my protector, and I never felt alone with him by my side. That all changed one evening when Baxter started acting. It was late. Baxter was lying on the floor near my feet, his eyes half closed. Suddenly, his ears perked up, and his body stiffened. He lifted his head and stared at the far corner of the room, growling low in his throat. I paused the TV, then looked over to where he was staring, but there was nothing there. Just the empty corner of the living room, where an old armchair sat, unused. "Baxter, it's okay," I said, trying to calm him down, but he didn't move. His growl grew deeper, more menacing, and his fur stood on end. His eyes were locked on that corner as if he saw something that I couldn't. I got up and walked over to the armchair, feeling a little foolish. There was nothing there, just the chair and a small lamp on the side table. I turned back to Baxter, who was now standing, his body rigid, teeth bared. "Baxter, stop," I said more firmly. But he wouldn't stop growling. He stayed in that position for what felt like an eternity, until suddenly he snapped out of it. He shook his head, glanced around the room as if confused, and then trotted over to me, wagging his tail as if nothing had happened. I chalked it up to him being overly protective. Maybe he heard something outside or smelled something I couldn't, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The following night, it happened again. This time, it was in the kitchen. Suddenly, he shot up, his ears pointed, eyes wide, and he began growling at the back door that led to the garden. I stopped what I was doing and looked outside. The garden was dark, the only light coming from the dim porch lamp. The trees swayed gently in the night breeze, but other than that, there was nothing unusual. But Baxter wouldn't stop. He stood there, growling, his hackles raised, as if something, or someone, was just beyond the door. I walked over and clicked on the porch light, illuminating the garden. The shadows retreated, but there was still nothing out there. I opened the door and stepped outside, feeling the cool night air against my skin. Baxter followed, his growl turning into a low whine as he sniffed the air. "Come on, Bax, there's nothing here," I said, trying to reassure him. But he wasn't convinced. He sniffed around the porch, his nose pressed to the ground, and then stopped suddenly at the far end. His growling started again, deeper this time, more urgent. He was staring at the dense line of trees that bordered my property. I squinted into the darkness, trying to see what he was looking at, but I couldn't make out anything. Just the thick shadows of the trees and the occasional rustling of leaves. Feeling a chill crawl up my spine, I called Baxter back inside and locked the door behind us. I told myself it was just a deer or a stray animal that had wandered into the yard, but Baxter's reaction left me unsettled. The next few nights were quiet. Baxter seemed to return to his usual self, and I almost forgot about the strange occurrences. That was, until the night I woke up to the sound of him barking. It was around 2 a.m., and Baxter was barking frantically downstairs. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, and rushed down to see what was going on. Baxter was at the front door, barking and scratching at it as if he was trying to get out. I flicked on the porch light and looked through the peephole. The street outside was empty, the houses dark and still. No one was there. I opened the door cautiously, and Baxter bolted out into the front yard, barking wildly into the night. I called after him, but he didn't stop. He ran to the far end of the yard, barking at something I couldn't see. My heart was pounding as I stepped outside, my eyes scanning the darkness. The night was eerily still, and all I could hear was Baxter's barking and the distant hum of crickets. I grabbed a flashlight from the porch and shone it in the direction. Baxter was barking, but there was nothing there, just the empty street and the darkened houses of my neighbors. "Baxter, come on," I called, my voice shaky. He stopped barking and turned to look at me, his ears flat against his head, as if he was scared. Slowly, he trotted back to me, his tail tucked between his legs. I brought him inside, locked the door, and sat down on the couch, trying to calm my racing heart. I didn't sleep much that night, and Baxter stayed close to me, his body tense as if he was still on high alert. The next morning, I checked the yard for any signs of what might have spooked Baxter, but there was nothing. No footprints, no disturbed plants, nothing out of the ordinary, but the sense of unease lingered. As the days passed, Baxter's strange behavior continued. He would growl at seemingly empty rooms, bark at the front door, and refuse to go into certain parts of the house, especially the basement. It was as if he could sense something that I couldn't, something unseen that was lurking just out of sight. One evening, as I was sitting in the living room, I heard a strange noise coming from the basement. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on the walls. Baxter, who was lying next to me, shot up immediately, his ears pointed, and began growling low in his throat. I froze, listening to the tapping. It was faint, but unmistakable, and it seemed to be coming from the far corner of the basement, where the old furnace was. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the flashlight and made my way to the basement door. Baxter followed me, his growl growing louder as we approached the stairs. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, before slowly opening it and shining the flashlight down the stairs. The basement was cold and damp, the smell of old wood and mildew hanging in the air. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was even more unsettling. Baxter refused to go down the stairs, his body tense, eyes fixed on the darkness below. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs slowly, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The flashlight beam swept across the basement, illuminating old dusty shelves and the rusted furnace in the corner. There was nothing there, no signs of anyone or anything, just the empty basement, as it had always been. But as I turned to go back upstairs, I heard it again, the faint tapping, this time coming from behind the furnace. My heart raced, and I shone the flashlight in that direction. But all I saw were shadows. I hurried back up the stairs, Baxter at my heels, and slammed the basement door shut. I locked it, even though I knew that wouldn't make a difference. Whatever was causing the noise, it wasn't something that could be kept out by a locked door. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound in the house seemed amplified, and Baxter was restless, pacing back and forth near the front door. I kept the lights on, but the sense of unease was overwhelming. The next day, I decided to call a friend of mine, Tom, who lived a few towns over. Tom was the kind of guy who didn't believe in anything supernatural. He was a skeptic through and through, and I figured he'd be able to give me a rational explanation for everything that had been happening. Tom agreed to come over that evening and take a look around the house. When he arrived, Baxter was unusually calm, as if the presence of another person had eased his anxiety. Tom and I went through the entire house from the basement to the attic, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of intruders, no strange marks or disturbances. Just the same old house I had been living in for months. After a thorough search, Tom shrugged. "It's probably just the house settling," he said. "Old houses make all kinds of weird noises. As for Baxter, dogs can be sensitive to sounds and smells that we can't detect. He's probably just reacting to something outside. Maybe a stray animal or a neighbor." I nodded, trying to convince myself that he was right. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else was going on. That night, Tom stayed over, partly as a favor to me, and partly because I think he was curious. After all, even though he was a skeptic, he couldn't deny that something strange was happening with Baxter. We had a few beers, watched a movie, and by midnight, the house was quiet. Tom set up a sleeping bag on the couch, and I headed upstairs to bed, feeling a little more at ease with someone else in the house. Baxter, however, wasn't so easily reassured. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the familiar sound of Baxter growling. His low, guttural warning was coming from downstairs. This time I wasn't alone in my dread. Tom was wide awake, too. I could hear him moving around, whispering Baxter's name. I threw on my robe and hurried downstairs. Tom was standing, peering outside. Baxter was at the front door again, his body tense, growling deep in his throat. "Did you hear that?" Tom asked as I came up beside him. "There was this scratching," Tom said, his voice low, like something was clawing at the door. I froze. Baxter's behavior was bad enough, but now that Tom was hearing things too, I knew I wasn't imagining it. I opened the front door, cautiously, the cool night air hitting me as I stepped onto the porch. I scanned the yard with a flashlight, but as usual, there was nothing, no movement, no sign of anyone or anything nearby. Tom stood beside me, frowning. "There's something wrong with this place," he muttered. "Maybe it's just an animal," I offered weakly. "Something tried to get into the trash bins or..." But Tom cut me off. "No, this was different. It wasn't random, it was deliberate." We went back inside, both of us more shaken than we wanted to admit. Baxter had stopped growling by now, but stayed close to the door, his ears perked, body tense. We sat back down on the couch, trying to make sense of it all. when suddenly the tapping started again. This time, it was unmistakable, coming from the basement at Tom. My eyes wide. "There it is," I whispered. "That's what I've been hearing." Tom's skepticism was beginning to fade, replaced by something more like concern. "All right," he said, grabbing a flashlight. "Let's check it out." "Are you serious?" I asked. "You just said something's wrong with this place." "Exactly," Tom replied. His jaw set. "And we need to figure out what." With a sinking feeling in my gut, I followed him to the basement door. Baxter stayed at the top of the feed, stairs whining softly as we descended into the darkness. The tapping grew louder the further down we went, echoing through the cold, damp space. The beam of Tom's flashlight swept across the basement, revealing the same empty shelves and cobweb-covered corners as before. But this time, there was something else. A soft, rhythmic knock coming from the far wall, right behind the furnace. We approached cautiously, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. As we got closer, Tom stopped abruptly and raised his hand for me to do the same. The knocking stopped. He moved the flashlight beam over the wall, and then he saw it. Something I hadn't noticed before. There, behind the furnace, was a small wooden hatch built into the wall, almost hidden by the shadows. It looked old, like it hadn't been opened in decades. "What the hell is that?" Tom muttered, stepping closer. "I've never seen that before," I whispered. "I didn't even know it was there." Tom reached out and touched the hatch, running his fingers along its edges. "Looks like some kind of access panel. Maybe for old plumbing or wiring, or maybe it leads somewhere," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The tapping started again, louder this time, as if whatever was on the other side knew we were close. Tom pulled his hand back, and we both stared at the hatch. Neither failed us daring to move. And then, without warning, the door to the basement slammed, shut upstairs. We both jumped, spinning around to look up the stairs. Baxter's frantic barking could be heard from the other side, and I raced up the steps, my heart pounding. I yanked the door open to find Baxter scratching at it, his eyes wide with panic. He bolted past me and into the living room, growling at something in the corner again. I turned to Tom, who had followed me back up the stairs. "What the hell just happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I don't know," he said, his face pale, "but I'm starting to think it's not just the house settling." For the rest of the night, neither of us slept. Baxter paced the house, growling and whining, while Tom and I sat in the living room, listening to every creak and groan of the old house. By morning, we were both exhausted, and Tom decided to head home, clearly disturbed by what had happened. "You need to get someone in here," he said before he left. "A priest, a medium, something. I don't know what's going on, but it's not normal." I nodded, but I didn't know where to start. "Who do you call when your dog seems to be seeing things? Strange noises come from behind basement walls." That day, I tried to go about my usual routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Baxter refused to leave my side, following me from room to room, his eyes constantly darting to dark corners or windows. Later that afternoon, I decided to take Baxter for a walk, hoping some fresh air would calm both of us down. As we walked through the quiet streets of the town, I noticed something strange. People were watching me, neighbors I had seen before but never had spoken to. They were standing on their porches or peeking through their windows, their eyes following me and Baxter as we walked by. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was as if they knew something they weren't telling me. When we got back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I locked the doors and windows, double-checking each one before settling back into the living room. Baxter lay at my feet, his body tense, ears perked. Quickly, and with it, the tapping returned. I sat in the darkened living room, the only light coming from the flickering TV screen. Baxter was lying beside me, his growl rumbling low in his throat. The tapping was louder now, more insistent, as if whatever was behind that hatch was trying to get out. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way to the basement again. Baxter at my heels. I stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness, my hand trembling on the doorknob. This time, I wasn't going down there. Instead, I shut the door and locked it, backing away slowly, whatever was down there. I didn't want to know. As I turned to go back to the living room, Baxter suddenly lunged at the front door, barking wildly. I rushed over and looked through the peephole, but once again, there was nothing there, just the empty street, silent and still. I pulled Baxter away from the door, trying to calm him down, but he wouldn't stop barking, wide with fear, and he kept glancing back at the basement door, as if he knew something I didn't. And then, I heard it, a soft, scraping sound coming from the garden. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I made my way to the back door and peered outside. The garden was dark, illuminated only by the dim porch light. The trees swayed gently in the moonlight. Everything was still, but then I saw it. Something moving at the far end of the garden, just beyond the line of trees. It was a shadow, dark and indistinct, but it was there, and it was watching me. I stepped back, my hand shaking as I locked the door. Baxter was barking again, his eyes fixed on the garden, his body trembling with fear. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with Baxter, listening to the sounds of the house creaking, the faint tapping from the basement, and the occasional rustle of leaves outside. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay at the house any longer. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stop. I packed a bag, grabbed Baxter's leash, and left without looking back. As I drove away from the house, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing at the edge of the garden, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the old house, silent and still. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened, not even Tom. I moved to a different town, hoping to start fresh, but that memories of that house and the things I heard and saw still haunt me. And sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet and still, I can still hear it. The faint, rhythmic tapping, as if something is trying to get out. Baxter hasn't been the same since. He's quieter, more anxious, and he still refuses to go near any doors at night. Maybe he knows something I don't, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that house isn't done with us yet.